In your work, you often stripped away the outlines of tradition. Was there an epiphany where you realized that art wasn't just about making, but about managing ideas and deconstructing power?
When you are making art, you go back and forth between process and product. When I was a younger artist, I was just making work, the act of working and laboring and seeing and making in the sense of not with a product in mind. As that progressed, I moved to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is where I'm at now, meaning the ideas become more important.
Do you remember like the first time you feel like art was something that you would want to commit, as in like practicing it full time?
When I was in secondary school, junior high, and high school in the United States, I was taking a lot of art classes there already. I'm just thinking about the practice of even moving your hands, because ultimately it's also a very manual activity to make art. A lot of what I do now is in my head and it's on the computer, kind of just aesthetics of making something and the process of making something that is the physical practice itself. If I'm reading a lot of material on the Vietnam War or French poetry from the 1900s, questions about those arise, and then they go into the work. And a lot of what we show as an artist is what we show. It's not everything that we do, it's not everything that we make. No matter where I am in time and place, whether I would have ended up kind of in the same predicament as I am now, my sentiment and my mentality when I was much younger was already thinking about aesthetic things, if you want to think about it that way.
So history is often a burden, but in your work seems more like a toolkit. How do you determine where your parents' historical narrative ends and your own creative world begins?
When it came to family, it took some time to think about that history and the medium I chose in terms of the early lever paintings. It was very much about how I'm unable to remember correctly, how my parents or brothers and sisters are not able to remember fully what happened 50 years ago now. It's not something that you can be very deliberate about. My art and the work that I do, it's all my world. I don't see any break where I can say my parents telling me that this is what I should be making or these are the questions I should be addressing. Those are all things that I'm fully in control of. What we show is just a small portion of what we're doing or what we're making as artists.
So your practice is notably multifaceted, seamlessly blurring the lines between artist, curator, producer, and gallerist. How does this perspective influence the understanding of an exhibition's architecture to you? When you look at the scale and infrastructure of an exhibition format abroad versus the landscape in Vietnam, what fundamental differences do you encounter in terms of institutional support and audience engagement?
In a way, they're kind of similar. You know, one could argue in Vietnam, there might even be more institutional support, more audience engagement in certain ways. In the West, I think there's a tendency to take for granted what you're encountering because you encounter it so much and on a regular basis. As an artist, I'm asking questions and answering it in my arts and the medium that I choose to answer that question in. As a curator, I'm doing the same. When I'm organizing or curating shows, I'm pursuing topics and ideas that I'm really interested in, but that I'm not interested in addressing as an artist myself. What I bring to it is, I think, a more kind of roundabout, encompassing view of the art world, and having kind of experienced many different systems and strategies within this system, I hope it's an accumulation of experiences that I can bring to the table to help artists and sustain artists more. Because in the back of my mind, I'm primarily an artist.
Can you tell me about your most recent curatorial project?
In 2016, I curated the inaugural exhibition at the Factory Center for Contemporary Arts. That was my first sojourn into discovering and educating myself about what was going on in technology and new media art in Vietnam at that time. I used to curate a lot when I was in New York and in the United States. When I was younger, I felt like I had more time to go and do studio visits and to really educate myself about what artists were working on. Because an exhibition is a response to a question, it's a response to something. The last exhibition that I organized with my partner here, and this was in 2019, 2020, we had organized kind of the first exhibition in this kind of new space in central Brussels that was on contemporary art being produced in Vietnam. I was really excited because I had just moved to Brussels that summer to bring Vietnamese art and Vietnamese-based art to Europe. But then COVID hit. So we had installed this exhibition fully in this space and had photographs framed, mounted, installed, and nobody saw the exhibition for 2 years. It was something that existed in press releases and in the archives of my curation.
When I look at your body of work, it appears to navigate to two primary trajectories. The first is a critique of socio-political hierarchies and structure of power. For example, your series of The Diabolical or Other Lives of Artists. The second is rooted in personal narratives, displacement, and familiar memory, such as the levers or perpetual paintings. Do you perceive these as distinct investigations, or is there a conceptual intersection where the political and the personal begins to fade into one another? And to what extent does the satirical lens act as a bridge to the vulnerability found in your memory-based works?
There is full overlap and full intersection. Something like the Heightline painting in The Diabolical, for instance. It looks very cold, it looks very illustrative, very geometrical, but at the same time, it's meant to index and measure the height of people. That aspect of it gets kind of pushed to the secondary layer, whereas in bright and colorful works like The Levers, one tends to think about the personal aspects of that because they're portraits of people. You know, we all relate to family pictures, family portraiture. But behind that also is collective longing, collective memory, and collective struggle as migrants or refugees or other people who are struggling in those ways. My work moves back and forth between those two things almost always. One could say that just about all my work has a social political angle to it, and all my work has a personal aspect to it.
I want to talk a little bit about the Lever series. So your practice here seems to be an exercise in revealing the gaps of a lost history. You begin with a static image like your family photos, and you reprocess it through the language of a coloring book, but then you push it further by making works such as Hanoi, the music for the Levers, the vinyl record, and eventually now you are working on a theatrical project for the Levers. Would you say that this childlike spirit is a form of resistance against the typical trauma-centric narrative of the refugee experience?
I don't know if I think about it in terms of a childlike experience for myself. You're conscious of leading the viewer on this journey. The work itself is about fragments. You're asking the viewer to fill in those gaps, not for you, but for themselves. They're more universal questions that I want to ask everyone when it comes to that kind of body of work. In terms of how it's progressed, that resulted from a series of interviews that I did with my family almost like 15 years ago now, when I interviewed them about the time we left Vietnam, because when we immigrated to the United States, we never spoke about it again. So I wanted to look at that intersection of memory. How do people remember this 2-week period before we left Vietnam and after we left Vietnam? Where do ideas and memories intersect, and how accurate are they? I pursued the Levers probably about 4 years ago now, when I had the idea that I wanted to use this original interview footage with my family as the basis for this theatrical project. What did interest me was to take these personal tidbits of information of family history to archive them. The little jumping point of my family story evolves in the play script into more universal themes about conservative extremism, physical evolution, whether that be sporting activities or bodybuilding competitions. It's just that in theater, you can put all those things in there. The Hanoi record is a work in its own right, something I'm working on with a friend, Fred Thomas in Detroit. Like most of my work, things move in and out of different mediums in some ways. They overlap, as we were speaking about earlier, how things kind of feed and bleed into one another kind of seamlessly. I want to think about it outside of it just being sound. So the Levers is just a project that I feel like I can throw all these questions in there all together and get some kind of response that is meaningful to a wider audience.
What do you think about other artists, poets, or writers working on this theme of refugee, the resistant war, and immigration in general. Do you think it's still relevant to this day?
I think it's relevant if you're experiencing it or if you've had some semblance of history of it. But I don't think it's the only defining factor for a lot of contemporary artists. I always find it interesting when I read, after I see the work, biographies on artists, and then connect that to what they're making. You as a young person born after the war versus someone like me who was born before the war. How do those things unfold? What's the significance of it? I don't have a problem with people making work about struggle and the war, and I think it's natural to. But at the same time, I also think that there are other ways of approaching those topics. And for me, it's usually the other ways of approaching them that I'm particularly interested in, even if my family, lived through that period. And even if I, in a way, should have more of a connection than what might appear.
In 2021, a flood in New York has destroyed a significant portion of your works and archives. This prompted you to question the permanence of art. Perpetual paintings emerge as a way to challenge the boundaries and definitions of an artwork's existence across both physical and virtual space, manifesting through prints, sculptures, and 3D designs. These works reside on Google's 3Ds warehouse, where they are accessible for anyone to recreate. What is the conceptual intent behind mass production or replication in this body of work?
They're meant to be downloaded. People can print them out. People can output them in multiple forms. You start thinking about what are the best ways to archive it, right? And to keep it for posterity. If you think about photography, it's a medium that is meant to be reproduced over and over. And yet in the art world, we tend to create limited editions. I think it really goes against what the medium of photography is. I want to take that further with this work, to question those processes of how we view collecting, how we preserve things personally. I'm utilizing it for several reasons. One is accessibility. I can get to that work whenever I need to for an exhibition, for a talk. In that regard, I'm also playing with ideas of supply and demand. If you are living in your head as an artist idea-wise, it's not always important to make something. And what does that mean when you have multiple versions of the same thing? It's almost like cubism, right? To kind of see it from every conceivable angle, including production.
I'm looking up the 3D warehouse and your series here. There are many, but the soup and the dining table. It's the red dining tables. So there is a clear synergy between your neon forward pop art palette and the project's focus on reproducibility. Is the choice of a high contrast neon palette a way to ensure the concept remains vivid and consistent, no matter who recreates the file or where is it produced?
The kind of bright aesthetic, I think, is the fact that it's just done on a computer. I generally am a person who likes color. The soup cans that you're looking at now, they come from Andy Warhol. I'm importing that saturation of color. It's kind of a contrast, because some of the ideas that I'm dealing with are kind of darker ideas than what they would allude to in terms of their bright color palette. You're dealing with the label being colorful. You're rotating around the object itself. You see that there's a recipe, that there's a poem written about something or another that is more social politically driven, that's more about commentary and criticism on what's going on in the news and in current events. It's this kind of point of entry that I use a lot in my bodies of work, to bring the viewer into the work at first through something that's recognizable and that's playful, but then kind of take them to the other end of the spectrum. And the nice thing about SketchUp is you can go as far as you want. The online aspect of it is something that people can really explore. And there's a richness to that I find that is far beyond the work when I print it out for an exhibition. When I print it out, it's just a single-sided, one image representation of an idea. In the art world, we want to think a lot about rarity and how when we are acquiring artworks, that these things are rare art objects. The works that you're looking at are very spontaneous. So for this, I would search for general terms like Vietnam, Vietnam War, Vietnamese food, pho, banh mi. I would just type in things from Vietnam Airlines and see what comes up. I grew up in Florida, so I used to watch the space shuttle launch, and the Kennedy Space Center is 30 minutes away on the beach. And when the shuttle launched, you could see it, the chemtrail or whatever. But you could see it very clearly in the sky, and you drag it down and download it, and then you put it in. To me, very much a digital still life. In the file, I provide the angle of how I had it painted. You're not limited to that. If this is the only output of the artwork that you want to own, I had it painted twice, and they're both from a slightly different angle. There is a unique aspect to it too that I'm really playing with. And these are questions that I'm asking, way rhetorically on a broader scale.
In your practice, painting often functions more as a conceptual category than a medium restricted to pigment on canvas. In this expanded definition, how do you define painting today?
It's paint on a surface. So if you're painting on cardboard or canvas or a mural on the wall, those are all paintings. The levers are actually all oil pastels, but I call them paintings. The medium is not particularly important to me. What is good painting is also what is good art. Beyond the aesthetic component of a painting, how it formally looks, what is the question that the artist is posing in this artwork, in this painting? A painting can be purely plastic, but even that can have depth. The questions are the important aspect, right? And then the response is the painting. I try to work myself backwards when I'm looking at painting to see what the questions the artist was asking and whether they're relevant. If you're painting a still life of an apple and oranges and dragon fruit, and you make 1,000 of them, what does that mean? I look at it from the perspective of somebody who's really critical of what painting is and what it could become. I'm someone who likes to envision painting as a challenge.
Your work frequently intersects with both art history and political archives. Aside from pop art, whose artistic philosophy has most deeply influenced your approach to subversion?
In terms of the popular culture angle that pop art comes from, I like the entry point of populism, of how people can enter a work because it's common, right? I like to be able to relate to people in a very simple, familiar way at first, whether that's colorful paintings or it's through a recognizable object. I want there to be a dialogue. And sometimes when there's a dialogue, you just have to throw in an obstacle to keep that dialogue kind of going. I mean, I think it's a combination of things, from things that you've seen to things that you've read, to movies that you've watched, through podcasts that you've listened to. There's people from Magritte, who is to me very layered. There's someone like Marcel Duchamp, who is very, very subversive and who I align with quite a bit in terms of their ways of thinking about art, whether that be when a viewer is looking at a work, it's the viewer who completes the work, right? Someone like Emzum Kiefer as a painter, whose works are very three-dimensional, very sculptural, whose work is about the profoundness of things, the Dadas or the Surrealists or the Impressionists. I studied a lot of those movements at some point in time. The important components of it stay with you. I would say that a lot of my influence comes from writing more than it does from visual art. I still find myself like going back to things I was reading in high school and junior high school and university. And that could be mythology, it could be symbolist poetry from the French in the 19th century. A lot of that writing still stays with me because poetry in general is much broader than what is written on the page. The more you read into and read between the lines of poetry, it alludes to much more than what's there on the page. When you're looking at someone like Stéphane Mallarmé, right, whose writings were poetic, but then the way he laid out the words on the page were very particular. Because when you're reading, I want the eye to move in this way. So is that a painting as well?
So for emerging artists, the open course circuit can feel like a labyrinth. How do you evaluate the strategic value of regional competitions versus international residencies?
Residencies are very targeted. So when you go to a residency, the ones that I've done, it's been because I needed a studio space in New York. I've never been to Istanbul, and I'm really interested in it culturally in terms of materials and processes in that region that relate to my work. I don't like doing residencies to take up the space for another artist who could use it better than I would. I tend to like the idea of like award. For instance, what UOB does with the Painting of the Year prize and competition, I think that's really invaluable to artists. because it's just another way of getting their work into the world and to get it seen by other experts, other critics. I don't think there's any harm and I don't think there's any drawback from participating in something like that. I like to go through and give artists and their works the attention it deserves. And that's what I was saying at the initial start of our conversation of how I always kind of put artists first. So I would say just send me as much information as you can. It's a good way for artists to see what else is being produced as well.